James Arness spent 56 years saying nothing about Amanda Blake, and then he said everything in one sentence. That sentence arrived handwritten on a single page, tucked into a plain envelope years after her death, and the small group of people who read it went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with shock. It was the quietness of recognition, of hearing something stated plainly that everyone had long suspected but never expected to actually be confirmed. Gunsmoke premiered on CBS in 1955 as a straightforward Western, lawmen, outlaws, and the kind of moral code carved from gunpowder and hard ground. The network wanted grit, a new criminal in Dodge City every week, a marshal who solved things with authority and showed nothing on his face afterward. What nobody planned for was what happened the moment James Arness stepped into frame as Marshal Dillon and Amanda Blake appeared behind the bar of the Long Branch Saloon as Kitty Russell. Audiences stopped watching a Western and started watching two people. Not characters lifted from a page, but people. The chemistry wasn't written into the dialogue. It lived in the space between lines, in the way Arness held still when Blake spoke, in the way she tilted her head when he came through the door, in the particular quality of silence that stretched between them just a few seconds longer than any scene required. 20 years of that. Nearly 600 episodes, and not one kiss, not one spoken confession, not one moment where either of them stepped across the line that every viewer could see them standing right at the edge of. CBS kept it that way deliberately. Executives had spent years building the show around a specific kind of character. Dillon didn't soften, didn't lean into sentiment, didn't give the audience romance when they had come for justice. The worry was that changing that formula, especially late in the show's run, would cost them the audience they had spent 2 decades earning. So the writers held the line, and what nobody anticipated was that the restraint itself would become the most discussed thing about the series. Viewers didn't just watch Gunsmoke, they studied it. Every shared glance got examined, every silence carried weight, and the question that first started moving through living rooms in the late 1950s was still circulating on fan forums and classic television communities 50 years after the fact. The two actors handled the public attention in different ways. Arness almost never gave interviews, and on the rare occasions when he did, he kept to safe territory. The craft of acting, the Western genre, the specific demands of playing one character for 20 years. Blake was more comfortable with the press, but equally guarded about anything personal. She described Arness publicly as a true professional. In private, she told people he was unreachable, and yet she never dismissed what existed between them. She described their bond as one of the most important relationships of her life, which is the kind of statement that doesn't come with a footnote. By the early 1970s, the show was aging, and so was Amanda Blake's patience with what Kitty Russell was being allowed to do within it. Nearly 20 years behind that bar, always the emotional foundation, always steady and present, but never at the center of her own story. Blake pushed the writers for more. A script reportedly came together, an episode that would have given Matt and Kitty a genuine moment, a real acknowledgement of what 20 seasons had been quietly building toward. The network rejected it. Arness, by some accounts, wasn't comfortable with it either. Blake received the news without making a scene. She just went quiet, and in 1974 she left. No farewell episode, no public announcement, no closing scene for a character she had carried for 2 decades. She walked off the lot and didn't look back. Arness said nothing publicly, not a single word. The show continued through 1975 without her, and Dodge City felt different in a way audiences could sense but couldn't quite name. The warmth that had carried the series hadn't come from the weekly plots or the gunfights. It had been coming from her, from the specific gravity she brought to every scene, and once she left, that particular warmth did not return. Amanda Blake spent her remaining years well outside Hollywood, redirecting her energy into animal rights activism and charity work. She declined interviews about the past, avoided retrospectives, and seemed to have made a quiet personal decision to leave that chapter closed. Arness retreated into near-total privacy as well. He turned down memoir deals, declined reunion appearances, and stopped doing press almost entirely. Both of them had apparently decided, independently and without consultation, that whatever they carried was theirs to keep. Blake passed away in 1989 at the age of 60. The tributes ran, the obituaries appeared, and James Arness stayed silent. No public statement, no interview, no gesture that gave anyone a window into what her death meant to him. People who knew Arness personally said he never moved on from it, not visibly or dramatically, but in the private ways that don't attract notice. A photograph of the two of them, taken off camera, somewhere between shooting seasons, sat near his reading chair in his home during his final years. Not displayed prominently, not framed like a tribute, just close, within reach. The edges worn the way something gets worn when it has been picked up and set back down many times over many years. In 2009, a production team developing a retrospective on classic American television reached out to Arness. He had declined requests like that for years, so the team didn't expect a response. He replied. His first question was whether Amanda Blake would be included in the program. When the producers confirmed she would, Arness said he wanted to contribute something. Not an appearance, not a recorded interview, just a letter. Several weeks later, an envelope arrived. 1 page, handwritten. Neat and careful, with no dramatic header and no formal closing. The letter opened with her first day on set. Arness wrote about how she arrived early, adjusted her own costume without waiting to be directed, pushed back on dialogue she felt made Kitty too passive, and fought from the very beginning for the character to have real strength and real dimension. He wrote about the long seasons when the pressure of carrying a show wore him down in ways he rarely showed, and how Blake was the person who made it bearable, not through anything loud or deliberate, but through steady presence. Through the kind of calm that doesn't ask to be noticed. He didn't claim a romance. He produced no confession designed for a headline. None of that was needed because the final line of the letter was heavier than any of it. He wrote that she always waited for him to say it, and he hoped she knew anyway. That sentence moved through classic television communities the way slow water moves, quietly, but all the way through. Fan forums spent weeks pulling it apart. What was the it he meant? Was this grief finally finding its shape? Was it the only form truth could take once the person it was meant for was no longer there to receive it? The producers who received the letter debated whether to release it publicly and ultimately honored Arness's request to keep it within the tribute. Word spread the way it always does, and the response wasn't what celebrity gossip produces. It was quieter than that. It felt like recognition. The story of a lost scene had been circulating in production circles for years before the letter surfaced. Editors, writers, and camera operators had told slightly different versions of the same account. That late in the show's run, a script was prepared in which Dillon walks into the Long Branch, finds Kitty behind the bar, and for the first time in the history of the series, kisses her. Some said the network pulled the scene before a frame was ever shot. Others said it was filmed on a closed set with a minimal crew and then shelved, the footage stored under a vague label in a California archive. A script supervisor recalled seeing a handwritten note on a late draft that read, "Kiss scene pulled." A retired editor described footage that vanished from the vault sometime in the late 1970s and was never accounted for. None of it has been confirmed? Blake, in one of her final interviews, was asked why Kitty and Matt had never kissed across 20 years of television, and she smiled and answered that some things are better left unsaid, or maybe unseen. Arness said nothing, as he always had, and that consistent silence made people believe more rather than less, because a man with nothing to protect doesn't stay that quiet for that long and that consistently. When Arness died in 2011, he left no memoir, no final interview, no revelation timed for an audience. He left traces, a worn photograph within reach of a reading chair, a handwritten letter in a plain envelope, and a quiet request made in 2010 when he declined another reunion appearance that Amanda Blake's name appear first in the tribute reel. He didn't frame it as a condition. He mentioned it once, softly, then moved on to something else. The people who worked on that tribute understood exactly what they were witnessing. This wasn't professional courtesy extended to a former colleague. This was a man spending one of his last public gestures on making something right, on giving the first word to someone who had walked away from 20 years without a farewell scene, without a proper goodbye, without the ending the character and the woman behind her had earned. Gunsmoke ran for 2 decades and never gave its audience the ending it had spent 20 seasons building toward. Matt and Kitty never said what they felt. James Arness and Amanda Blake never explained what they shared, and yet the story holds and keeps holding. New viewers find old episodes and fall into the same pull, study the same silences, and ask the same questions audiences were asking in 1955. That staying power doesn't come from plot mechanics or production value. It comes from something real bleeding through the screen, something that didn't belong to the characters at all, but to the people playing them. Whatever existed between Arness and Blake across 20 years on those sets, whatever they protected by never naming it, was real enough to outlast both of them. And the fact that neither of them ever put a word to it may be exactly the reason it still holds.